Hey, what's up, everybody? John TheMorgile back for a quick video response to some comments I received from Voice of Reason. I actually started doing this in the typical way, which would be to reply to his comments in the threads of my video, which worked a few times. So I was actually able to comment back and forth with him a couple of times. But for some reason, as you can see here, when I try to send a specific response to one of his comments, YouTube will simply not accept or allow me to post the comment. I've tried since yesterday, tried it again today, saves it on a notepad file, so I'm doing a video response instead of making the comment. So I'm also going to respond to another comment that Voice of Reason placed on that video comments thread more recently, and just kill two birds with one stone, right? So I usually don't like a rigged game or unfair odds. But when you're debating someone about the game of chess, for example, when your opponent has only ever played checkers and knows nothing of chess, it's technically not a debate, as you must teach your opponent about the subject matter as opposed to debating the facts of the matter. To further this analogy to the comical level that it really ought to be if your opponent were to tell you that no such game as chess exists, and that checkers is the only board game of that sort, then the debate, which became a series of lessons to your opponent, finally becomes in its most absurd and proper analogous form, proving to your opponent that the game of chess actually does exist, whether they're aware of it or very good at it or not. So on we go to the original post from Voice of Reason in response to my Thanksgiving special video, which was a mega debunking of his attempt to debunk the reality of the static plane Earth. Now, Voice of Reason's original post was, quote,
"Thanks for covering my video. I appreciate the added exposure and will enjoy responding to your claims. Orbital mechanics are a physical impossibility? Really? How so? I've watched the moons of Jupiter orbit the planet with a telescope. Have you? We can accurately predict the future positions of planets, comets, and asteroids using Newton's laws. How could that be? This is fully tested science. I really don't know how you can deny this."
Now, one thing I'll mention just sort of off the cuff real quick is that Ptolemy was able to predict, and accurately so, predict orbital patterns of planets using a geocentric model. So your argument there is invalid. The Earth doesn't have to be a globe in order to predict the orbital cycles of the wandering stars, aka planets. And I will remind you that the root of the word planet is plane, and was first ascribed to the world as being a plane, and then later ascribed to the wandering stars, which must also be, like our world, and therefore plane became planet, and our world became a planet instead of a plane, if you can follow the ridiculous logic. So, anyway, this is my formal response to your comment that I just read, which I should have end quoted at,
I don't really know how you can deny this.
You're welcome for covering your video and the added exposure. Anytime. I only intended to make a short video, however, I've explained to you in another comment why a great deal of explanation is needed from my side of the argument, as a simple word is revered or bowed to by most people who believe in the globe, such as gravity. There's literally no way to convince a person that the heliocentric model is wrong. Each individual person must decide to reevaluate all of the previous assumptions that we've had about the world and the universe, and by extension ourselves, for our entire lives, and it can be a difficult thing to do. As for your analogy about the moons of Jupiter, by your logic, you can observe what appear to be spheres flying around in the night sky. Therefore, we must live on a sphere flying around in the night sky. The same logic dictates that since a bowling ball is spherical, then bowling pins must be spherical. Actually, a better way to depict your logic would be to assume that since you can see bowling pins at the end of the lane, then you, the observer, must also be a bowling pin, right? Same logic. So, what's so astonishingly ridiculous about your observation of Jupiter is the fact that you can see Jupiter with the naked eye. Jupiter has a diameter of about 87,000 miles, but you can see it from the ground with the naked eye at a minimum distance of 365 million miles away, and again, that's minimum. Now, keep in mind, about 90 million miles of this expanse between the Earth and Jupiter would be filled with the so-called asteroid belt, which should technically obstruct our view towards Jupiter, as the majority of objects comprising the so-called asteroid belt are more or less aligned to the ecliptic plane, just as Earth and Jupiter allegedly are in the heliocentric model. The problem is, the nearest portion of the asteroid belt is supposedly 1/4 of the distance to Jupiter, so much closer to us than Jupiter, and therefore would appear optically much larger, angular size. So you would expect all of the billions of alleged asteroids and meteoroids to apparently transit the inbound reflected light from Jupiter. But of course, we can see Jupiter with the naked eye at a minimum distance of 365 million miles and a maximum distance of 600 million miles, but at that point it would technically be on the opposite end of the sun, so we could never see it at its furthest. Could we? Right? Anyway, this isn't the main point of the matter, but if you actually believe you can see an object with a diameter of 87,000 miles from 365 million miles of space through 90 million miles, which is supposedly filled with billions of asteroids aligned with the Earth and Jupiter, they would thus obstruct our view of the object, but that isn't even the point either. But if you do believe all this, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. The main subject of your comment involved orbital mechanics and how you think they are possible in a heliocentric model, when indeed such things as third-generation satellite bodies like the Moon are indeed impossible. Now, the only possible way that you can maintain your position is without studying this subject objectively, or animating the alleged orbital relationships between the galactic center, the Sun, the Earth, and the Moon in that order. Now, orbital mechanics are indeed an impossibility in the heliocentric model for a variety of reasons, illustrated best by considering third-generation satellite bodies, such as the Moon. Now, I'm not going to try and bring out all of the arguments, as I've spent hundreds of hours making videos giving in-depth explanations disproving the viability of orbital mechanics in a heliocentric model, where all of the centers of orbit are in constant acceleration. Now, you're going to call foul on this and parrot scientism and say that they're not accelerating, but moving at an essentially constant, non-variable speeds. However, that is a complete fallacy. An object at a consistent speed traveling along a rectilinear path would certainly, be a good fixed frame of reference without any acceleration, like a train going exactly 50 miles an hour along a perfectly straight track without hitting any bumps. On the other hand, an object allegedly moving along a curvilinear path at 500,000 miles an hour, such as the Sun, would experience constant acceleration, as it's supposedly traveling at a constant speed along a parabolic curve. This acceleration due to curvilinear motion would cause massive centrifugal forces towards the outside edge of orbit due to traveling at a consistent speed along an inverse square curve. Next, you have the Earth, which is supposedly orbiting the Sun at a 60-degree angle to the Sun's orbital plane or orbital path at 66,600 miles an hour. Now, keep in mind, the galaxy is also supposedly traveling some millions of miles per hour at an angle which is divergent from the Sun's path, yet the Sun somehow remains fixed to a single plane of orbit relative to the galactic equator. Meanwhile, all this nonsense is allegedly occurring. The Earth itself is maintaining its perfect orbital plane relative to the Sun, aka the ecliptic, which is again a divergent angle to the plane of the Sun's orbit, or the solar plane. Finally, you have a theoretical third-generation satellite body, such as the Moon, which is allegedly racing around the Earth, roughly aligned to the ecliptic, about 5 degrees divergent from the ecliptic, at 2288 or 2,288 miles per hour. Now, if you can possibly imagine all of this motion, which is all constantly in relative flux from 1 second to the next, and the moon is supposedly traveling in multiple conflicting directions simultaneously while somehow maintaining a perfect plane of orbit relative to the Earth, although the three orbital hosts, the galactic center, the Sun, and the Earth, are constantly changing angular relationships between one another at varying speeds. Furthermore, each of these independent bodies somehow orbit one another along their own personal invariable plane of orbit round their orbital host, which is physically impossible, but that's not even the point. If you actually believe this physical impossibility is true, however, like I said, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. I'm going to go even deeper into this topic just for a bit, just because I wanted a break from working on my next video, which I've actually just released. And of course, I'm making this video because YouTube would not allow me to post this comment that I'm verbally reading to you. So, in case you want multiple audio visual presentations regarding the physical impossibility of orbital mechanics in a heliocentric model, I'll put a link to my playlist, The Fallacy of Gravity, as well as Disproving Orbital Motion, which could be very helpful for you if you pay attention. So now that we've established exactly what I mean by a third-generation satellite body, such as the moon, we'll quickly consider one single point which will demolish the idea of orbital mechanics in a heliocentric theory and in physical practice as well, as it is a fallacious ideology that couldn't possibly occur in reality. This is apparent if you honestly, skeptically analyze the claims made in the heliocentric model. Now, you claim the moon orbits the spherical Earth once per month. This means that during two adjacent half moons, about 13.5 days apart, you would have two totally opposite conditions which are supposedly caused by gravity, defined as a constant tug of war or dynamic tension between two objects depending on mass and density, proximity, velocity, with the vacuum of space as the theoretical tether between these two objects. Since the Earth is the greater of the two objects, you can practically say that the Earth is the greater source of gravity than the moon. Of course, space-time is the tether between the two, because we all know an infinite vacuum makes for an excellent structural or tensile material, right? But only in your imagination verse theory, of course. Now, all of that aside, during half moon A, which is due east of the Earth's path along the ecliptic, the Earth is supposedly traveling directly towards the moon at about 66,600 miles an hour. The moon is less than 250,000 miles from the gravitationally rich Earth, a mere 3 hours, 45-minute journey for the Earth to reach the moon, in case you were wondering. Now, you believe it's the moon's speed and trajectory which allow for it to go well around the front of the Earth's path. Now, are you with me so far? Because I'm about to burst your bubble. Now, once the moon has reached the next half-moon phase, or the west side of the Earth half-moon phase, the Earth would be racing away from the moon at 66,600 miles an hour. So what must occur here in order for the moon to do a 180 turn in space, accelerate to speeds well faster than the Earth, to surpass the Earth, and make its curvilinear journey to the next half-moon phase on the east side of the Earth's trajectory around the Sun? Would you predict that the moon needs to A. decelerate, B. continue at the same speed, C. accelerate a little, D. accelerate a lot, or E. accelerate to many times faster than the Earth? The answer is E, because, for one, the point in the moon's orbit when it's on the west side of the Earth's trajectory would be a point when the moon had been traveling in the opposite direction as the Earth, away from one another, then curving around the backside of the Earth using gravity of the Earth to slingshot the moon many times faster than the Earth, as the moon must somehow surpass the Earth, which is traveling 66,600 miles an hour, while the moon travels a mere 2288 miles per hour on average, relative to the Earth, the moon must beat the Earth along the outside of the track, no less, by first catching up to the Earth 238,000 miles away, then pass the Earth another 8,000 miles, which is the diameter of the Earth, then reach the next half-moon phase, which is another 238,000 miles along the moon's alleged curved orbital path, within the same duration from one half-moon to the next. Now, keep in mind the moon somehow makes each leg of this journey from one half-moon to the next over approximately the same duration, or about 13 and a half days between each adjacent half-moon. Now, if you think about this for 10 seconds objectively, it is physically impossible for the duration of each leg of this orbit to be remotely similar, let alone approximately equivalent, as the moon would be racing west 2288 miles per hour in the opposite direction as the Earth, doing 66,600 miles per hour east for the first leg of the orbit. Now, in case you haven't made the connection, the moon and the Earth would be traveling in the same direction for the second leg of the journey, or racing against one another, meaning the duration between one half moon to the next should be wildly different comparatively, simply due to the law of physics involving relative speed. To give you an example of this, or relative speed, you can prove in daily life very easily. Just simply drive down the highway doing 65. The traffic to your left, also doing 65 coming towards you, will apparently zoom past you at 130 miles per hour relative to you. If you look at the traffic on your right, who are all doing, say, 70, they will apparently be moving 5 miles per hour faster than you. Now, the same rule applies to the moon when it's traveling either with traffic east or against traffic west, traffic being the Earth in this analogy, of course. Now, I've actually animated a helpful 2D model of orbital relationships of the galactic center to Sun to Earth to Moon in that order. And what I found by studying the finished animation, or really the lines ascribed to the paths of each object in the finished animation, is that the only way to make a theoretical third-generation satellite body such as the moon work, in theory, is if the moon greatly accelerates to extreme velocities at some points, and stands still or even retrogrades at other points, due to the velocity of the Earth and the law of physics involving relative speed of independent bodies in motion, and the claim that the moon maintains a constant or pretty much constant relative speed to the Earth. Now, this is honestly physics 101 sort of stuff, but this is all exacerbated by an observation that I didn't realize until I studied the path of the moon as a continuous squiggly line, not an elliptical circular path whatsoever. It isn't. It was then that it dawned on me that the only way to make such an animation work with the galactic center to Sun to Earth to Moon is to reverse the relative speeds of all of the objects. In other words, the only way to make such an animation work is to have the galactic center moving as the very slowest object of all, with the Sun being slightly faster than the galactic center, but slower than the Earth, which is of course slower than the moon, but only in the animation. In other words, the moon is the fastest object in the animation by necessity, and there's no possible way to account for all of the contradictory motions of the bodies, which somehow maintain their perfect relative planes of orbit and relatively elliptical paths and planes of orbit, with gravity as the only thing holding all of these perfectly cyclical, balanced relationships together. Now, anyway, back to the half moon example. The point to this is the amount of gravity needed to slingshot the moon, which is traveling, west 2,200 miles an hour, round the back of the Earth, which is traveling east at 66,000 miles an hour. That's where gravity kicks in and accelerates the moon to a tremendous extent. If you try and figure this out, it's actually sort of mind-boggling. Again, during the first leg of the orbit, the Earth-Moon relative speed is 68,888 miles per hour, because the moon's going that way and the Earth's going this way. It covers the full diameter of its orbit in 13.5 days. Now, gravity magically kicks in, providing the centripetal force necessary to negate the centrifugal force of an object as theoretically massive as the Moon, traveling at such a velocity in the opposite direction as the Earth's path. Now, gravity must be an extremely powerful force indeed to accelerate the Moon 180 degrees and allow for the Moon to surpass the Earth in exactly 13.5 days, while they are now supposedly racing against one another, notwithstanding the alleged 238,000-mile head start given to the Earth in this leg of the Moon's alleged orbit. Even worse, the Moon is traveling around the outside of the track, as I've mentioned before, so it technically, necessarily, has a further distance to travel relative to the Earth's path over the same period. But we'll just backburner that because you must admit it's impossible for the Moon to make its east to west path in 13.5 days and make its west to east path in 13.5 days relative to the Earth, which is in constant motion east. Just keep in mind that I'll give the globe Earth hypothesis all sorts of freebies for argument's sake, because even a small portion of the damning evidence is sufficient to debunk the globe Earth mass hysteria. Anyway, once the Earth's powerful trajectory is poised directly in line with the Moon's trajectory, where is all that powerful gravity that just slingshotted the Moon round the back of the Earth, inertia be damned, and allowed for the Moon to somehow race against the Earth and magically arrive at the next half-moon phase exactly 13.5 days later, just as it did when the Earth and Moon were racing away from one another? Are we to assume that gravity is repelling the Moon away from the Earth on its east side full moon? Remember, the Earth's velocity puts the Moon at a mere 3-hour, 45-minute trip, although the two objects should technically be pulling towards one another with enough force to perform the orbital acrobatics described so far in the first leg of the journey. So technically, the Earth and Moon should accelerate towards one another when the half moon is in the east. Science claims that the Moon maintains a nearly constant speed relative to that of the Earth. However, the only way that could be possible would be if the Moon were constantly changing speeds, and not just a little. The Moon would need to beat out the Earth round the outside of the track sometimes. The Moon would also need to travel exactly the same speed and direction as the Earth at other times, and the Moon would need to stand still in space, possibly even retrograde, in order to keep its speed relative to the Earth more or less constant. By the way, just check out my video playlist called Disproving Orbital Mechanics for better explanations with diagrams and animations. Okay, so here's another one of your comments that I was unable to respond to in the same sort of way. I don't know if you blocked me or if YouTube's acting up, what, I don't know. So I'm doing a video response to your comment. So I'll just read your comment and sort of interject as we go. Should be fun. Okay, so this is your comment.
TheMorgile, you're right. You are verbose, lol. I don't have time to respond to all of this right now, so we can start to talk about gravity. Question mark. It appears to be your biggest obstacle to accepting that we could be on a globe. I agree with much of what you said. Your what goes up must come down really is exactly what we experience. I don't know why you choose to say gravity has never been proven when, no matter what you call it, all objects we can practically examine follow the same mechanics. They go down when unsupported. This is true whether we live on a flat plane or a sphere.
Okay, this is where I call bullshit on what you're saying. For one thing, when I say gravity's been disproved, I don't mean that what goes up must come down has been disproved. What I mean is the prevailing theory in an Einsteinian cosmology, with the warping of space-time being causal of the force of gravity, that's what I'm saying has been debunked. Okay, what goes up must come down is never going to be debunked because that's just how reality operates on the physical plane that we've always lived on. Just wanted to make that very clear, and I'm not sure why you would allude to the assumption that I was somehow insinuating that what goes up must come down will or should ever try to be disproved, because that is again, it's a law of nature. Gravity is merely a theory to explain this observation, only assuming that the Earth is a spinning sphere in the void of outer space. You're saying that all objects
go down when unsupported. This is true whether we live on a flat plane or a sphere.
Now, you're leaving a little bit out here. What goes up must come down makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I guess you could say it must happen on a plane. But what you're failing to mention is that the Earth isn't just any sphere where we say live on the top. It is a spinning sphere flying around a curved path around the sun, allegedly at 66,600 miles an hour, at a 60-degree angle to the sun's path around the alleged galactic center, as the sun races 450 to 500,000 miles an hour around the galactic center, more or less adhering to the galactic equator, but keeping its perfect plane of orbit, even though the galaxy itself is in motion contrary to the sun. In the heliocentric model, of course. So, for you to say that what goes up must come down, must happen on a plane, and it must happen on a sphere, is totally wrong. That's a bullshit statement. The only way that you can have something like what goes up must come down, because literally think about it. I mean, imagine, say, the gravitron at the fair. If you've ever been to the gravitron at the fair, you'll know that when that thing starts to spin, due to centrifugal force, you're compelled to stick to the outside edge of the wall. And indeed, you can walk around on the outside edge of the wall because of the centrifugal force generated by a spinning body that is much larger than yourself, that you are stuck to. Now, if you can somehow imagine crawling up the outside edge of the gravitron, hanging on for dear life, all right, you probably wouldn't last 10 seconds, trying to hang on, right? But suppose that there was some equal and opposite force, some magical inward force, like, say, a chain, like you're fastened with chains to the outside of the gravitron, then you could, probably remain stuck to the side of it, but it would be pretty hard to walk around because you have to be tightly fastened due to the centrifugal force, right? So what you need is the theory of gravity in the heliocentric model, which is indeed a theory and was conveniently proven by LIGO using the most precise measuring device ever built, the whatever interferometer device that they supposedly use to see, 3.5 billion years into the past. I call bull crap on this. Isn't it convenient that they discovered this, last year? Don't you seem it's just a bit convenient? And if you actually listen to what the guy said, I don't even have to play a clip. I've made 2 videos on it. He says that they measured a phenomenon. And what that measurement was, as time went forward, the frequency went up. And that is a direct quote. As time went forward, the frequency went up. And it was seen about the same time, nearly the same time, at 2 different locations. Okay, so what you have is you have a chart, right? With this arm here is time, and this is frequency. As time goes forward, frequency goes up, right? And they spent months debating on whether or not this was in fact a gravitational wave.
But it was in fact a gravitational wave.
And they've convinced themselves that is the case. And he is here today to present this to you. Now, what does he present to you? He presents to you 2 real computer simulations. Do you get that? 2 real computer simulations. The first real computer simulation is the gravity waves. And what that is a CGI animation rendered from a computer. The second thing that you have is CGI renderings of imaginary black holes based on a frequency picked up by an interferometer device and charted. I've got a couple videos where I've covered this and explained how the guy making those claims was not making any sense. They haven't proved anything. They've convinced themselves of a theory, and as a matter of fact, I remember reading about that most precise measuring device that it'll detect trucks driving by 5 or 10 miles away. So, I think we need to be a little bit more careful when claiming to prove gravity waves, because gravity technically only needs to exist if we assume that the Earth is a spinning sphere in outer space, which indeed it is not.
We all experience it. Forgetting about objects in space for the moment, we agree this always happens. I call that gravity. You call it what goes up must come down, or a law of Earth physics. Doesn't matter what you call it, it happens. And it doesn't happen randomly, it happens predictably with a consistently measured acceleration. Let's also set aside for a moment why we think it happens. The effect is proven. You can't show me any examples when what goes up must come down has failed to occur, as far as I know, and I don't think that you can claim there are any, so I don't know why you say it has never been proven.
Again, I've never claimed that what goes up must come down has ever failed to occur under the normal circumstances where you have a high density object such as an apple or whatever. I don't know why you would claim that. What I'm saying is that the theories supporting the heliocentric model as gravity, it's not what you call it. The theory is necessary in your model, and only in your model, to ensure that you and I and everything else remain stuck to the side of a spinning sphere. That's the whole purpose of gravity, and there is no use for gravity when you realize that the Earth is a stationary plane. The theory of gravity has been disproven, but what goes up will still come down.
Balloons and boats do not defy gravity, they work with it due to buoyancy, as you said. It always works. In science, that's about as proven as it gets. Science is not absolute. It is always open to more evidence.
Really?
Until you show evidence that gravity does not work in any experiment, and because all experiments show that it does work, then it is proven. That is what it means to be proven. I really don't know why you think it is not proven. What further experiments need to be done to prove it? You just aren't making any sense.
I'm sorry, but I mean this in the least offensive way possible, but you are totally freaking clueless. No matter how many times you drop a brick on your foot, or jump off a bridge, or throw a grenade in the air, as long as you're standing somewhere near the ground, it's going to come back down, for sure. Unless it's a helium balloon or a dragonfly that can hover perfectly and whatnot. But in normal circumstances, yes, what goes up will certainly come down. What you fail to understand is that that is not the debate here at all. Again, what goes up must come down is a fact of life. It's a law of nature under normal circumstances that are indeed governed strictly by density and buoyancy. Now, you have mentioned that density and buoyancy need a tendency for higher density objects to sort of have a tendency to find their way down. Now, this fundamental force is not gravity, or you could call it gravity, but it's not caused by a warping of space-time of the spherical Earth, because the Earth isn't a sphere. Furthermore, space-time is a fabrication or an imaginary theory created by Albert Schilstein. On top of all that, you seem, for some reason, to think that the observation or the law of nature that what goes up must come down is somehow exclusive proof that the Earth is a spinning sphere. Now, if you actually think about this for 10 seconds, you'll realize that if the Earth were indeed a spinning sphere, what goes up must come down is the exact opposite of what you'd expect. And so you need this theory of gravity to provide the necessary centripetal force to counterbalance the centrifugal force caused by a body as massive as the Earth spinning over 1,000 miles per hour at its outermost edge, or at the equator. Now, one of the biggest problems with gravity, since you're obviously, you haven't watched my videos, I'll just describe this very quickly. But one of the biggest problems with gravity is the fact that gravity is sufficient to counterbalance, say, a ton of coffee at the equator, which is spinning 1,037.5 miles per hour east, allegedly, and dropping vertically along that curve of the equator at 136 miles per hour, allegedly standing, perpendicular to the axis of rotation, which is a nearly 4,000 mile radius. Now, gravity must be a fairly significant force to keep an observer or a ton of coffee or, say, the oceans from flying off of the spinning Earth, because although the RPMs are low, indeed, 1 RPM per one rotation per 24 hours is not a high RPMs. However, if you look into machining and gyroscopic forces, it is not the rotations per minute that matter, as long as the radius of curvature is a major variable, which of course, nearly 4,000 miles radius of curvature is extremely distant in human terms. It may not be that distant in Earth terms, but it is extremely distant in human terms, in terms of axis of rotation radius. Furthermore, 1,037.5 miles an hour is well beyond the speed of sound. Okay? And you may call this eastward velocity a fixed frame of reference without experiencing any acceleration. However, you're forgetting all about allegedly zipping around an inverse square curve, which would necessitate you vertically dropping 135 miles an hour, or somewhere over 700,000 feet per hour. Okay, so quickly juxtapose this with the same observer or ton of coffee or body of water at the North Pole. What you'll find at the North Pole, allegedly in the spherical Earth hypothesis, is that any observer or object is on top of the axis, standing parallel to the axis, spinning 0.0 miles per hour, or half the speed as the hour hand on a 12-hour clock, not zipping around any curve eastward at any 1,000 miles per hour, in fact 0 miles per hour, and not dropping along this parabolic curve at 136 miles per hour. Now, the problem is that your beloved theory of gravity is supposedly pushing inward upon the spherical Earth evenly at all points, due to the mass of the Earth warping space-time. The issue is not that gravity is applying itself much harder at the North Pole, although it would appear that way. The difference is there is no centrifugal force to be counterbalanced at the North Pole. So the tremendous amount of centrifugal force generated at the equator, where again you're standing 4,000 miles distance from the axis of rotation, and you are zipping eastward along a parabolic curve at 1,037 miles and a half, vertically dropping along that curve at 135 miles per hour, and gravity allows you to nice and neatly walk around the outside edge of that, gravitron, so to speak. The fact that this centrifugal force would be infinitely greater at the equator relative to the pole means that the same force of gravity applied to the observer or ton of coffee at the equator then applied to the observer or object at the North Pole would render the object at the North Pole hundreds of thousands of times more heavy on a scale, simply due to the lack of outward thrust or centrifugal force at the North Pole. Now, people have traveled to the North Pole and they weigh slightly more. It's such a very small amount. You can practically say people weigh exactly the same at the North Pole. Now, the slight difference in weight is indeed accounted for naturally by the simple fact that the barometric pressure of the world at large is highest in the North Pole and gradually diminishes as you get towards the equator and continues to diminish beyond the equator, which is odd. But certainly, barometric pressure, when you've got colder air, more dense air, it presses down upon you at with slightly more pounds per square inch, and so that perfectly accounts for the weight disparity of a ton of coffee at the North Pole versus a ton of coffee at the equator. Uh, this tiny amount of difference in weight that is really not even worth mentioning is certainly not justified by the alleged infinite disparity in centrifugal force between the theoretical equator and theoretical North Pole on the non-existing theoretical spinning globe Earth.
But anyway, we can agree we have an observation that things go down, so really our only disagreements are how it works and in what direction it occurs. I'm no physicist, so explaining why and how gravity works is above my pay grade, bending of space time, relativity, and all that, but we can set that aside as well.
No, you cannot set that aside as well. What the hell are you talking about? That's the fundamental premise that we're arguing. Again, I think for some reason you feel that flat earthers are arguing that what goes up is not going to come down under normal circumstances. I mean, really, where are you coming from? Your logic is just completely ridiculous.
There is another aspect of gravity that is based on tremendous evidence, and that is that it depends on the mass of the bodies involved. A simple scale will show us that a piece of lead is heavier than a piece of wood the same size. By heavier, I mean pulled down stronger. This is due to the mass of each object, the total amount of its molecules. Lead is more dense than wood, so it has more molecules. The more mass, the stronger the downward pull. You can lift a tennis ball, but not a car. The difference is mass. With me so far?
Mhm. Yes, indeed, I am with you, and you are making less and less sense with every breath you take. First of all, it's counterintuitive as it seems. An object at the equator should technically decrease in terms of weight on a scale as its mass is increased. Now, I know that sounds a little weird at first glance, but you got to remember the centrifugal force at the equator. There's a little experiment that you can do to sort of prove this point. Grab two 1 pound weights, stretch your arms out to your sides, and begin to spin. Then replace the 1 pound weights with 10 pound weights and spin at the exact same speed, and you'll notice that the 10 pound weights would be tugging outward on your arms with more force than the 1 pound weights. This means that technically, if the Earth was actually a spinning sphere, especially at the equator, more and more massive objects should become less and less heavy on a scale. Yet, of course, we see that regardless of your longitudinal or latitudinal conditions, your weight on a scale certainly increases with mass, even at the equator. Secondly, so what you're arguing is that because a cubic centimeter of steel weighs more than a cubic centimeter of balsa wood, therefore the Earth is a globe spinning in outer space and proves gravity. Really, that is a pretty huge leap in logic using tons of assumptions that you need to readdress as a rational, skeptical adult. The assumptions I'm talking about, for one example, would be that you are stuck to the side of a spinning sphere in outer space.
So, even if gravity were due to electromagnetism, as you claim, you disagree, it still has a component that is based on its mass, right? So, since mass affects how objects are pulled down, then it's logical that the pull effect is due to the mass of the Earth pulling against the mass of the object. Why is that so hard to accept?
Give me one single example of demonstrable example of mass being attracted to mass, and something other than the Cavendish experiment, because that's a pile of horse shit. Okay, excuse my French. You cannot demonstrate mass being attracted to mass unless there's an electromagnetic or magnetic relationship involved. Period. End of story. That's why I find it so hard to believe.
I want the bullshit.
You can't handle the bullshit.
Bullshit.
Why is that so hard to accept? Why would that not be the case? It's very logical, but logical is not enough. We need evidence to see if this bears out in reality. Well, we have tremendous evidence.
Sailing the seas of bullshit.
Nothing I have claimed is without evidence. You like to say I believe or I've been indoctrinated.
Meaning you believe or you've been indoctrinated.
No, I've looked at the evidence. Evidence is that you ignore or discount.
Meaning me, I ignore or discount.
The evidence that gravity is due to the mass of the Earth includes the following. 1. The inverse square law. The farther away two bodies of mass are, the less the pull of gravity. This is demonstrated by the difference between the acceleration of an object like an apple falling near the Earth and the acceleration of the moon.
Dude, I'm so sorry, but you're just so completely full of it, honestly. You're claiming that because apples fall from trees and you see the moon orbit and you assume the Earth is a sphere and you assume that that sphere is governed by gravity, and that gravity is caused by a warping of space-time due to the Earth displacing the rectilinear natural state of space-time, creating a sort of surface tension and ripple through a vacuum of gravity waves. All of this is non sequitur, okay? An apple is not the moon. A moon is not the apple. You're talking about theory here. You're trying to relate the fact that an apple will fall from a tree, and you're claiming that that is caused by the same force that allows the moon to allegedly orbit the spherical Earth. Now, all of this is begging the preliminary proof that the Earth is a sphere of any sort in the first place, and again, the inverse square curvature law would be the one that you really need to look at, because we're talking about basic geometry here. There is no inverse square curvature of the Earth, therefore it could not possibly be anything but a plane. Furthermore, since the Earth is proven by physical experiments to be stationary, not spinning, not orbiting, there's no possible way that a stationary plane that the Earth is proven to be could also be a spinning sphere at the same time. Therefore, all of your non sequitur leaps of logic relating apples to the moon, because Newton wrote it down in a book several hundred years ago before electromagnetism was invented or discovered, before people knew how to fly in airplanes, before we had weather balloons, before we had communications, computers. Newton wrote down a ton of theories that he said were probably not real. He was just describing orbital mechanics with the theory of gravity as, something as a possibility. And even he admitted that it was probably not true. It was merely a theory.
And you put a link to the inverse square law. If the mass of the Earth has nothing to do with gravity, then please explain this observation.
This is where I sound a resounding no. I refuse to prove any of your globe Earth observations or theories until you prove axial rotation and overall curvature. Until then, the globe is dead. Capiche?
2. Observations of heavenly bodies in orbit. The easiest to observe besides our own moon are the moons of Jupiter. You can see them for yourself with an inexpensive telescope, and they revolve fast enough that you can see a significant part of an orbit in a single night. I've seen it myself. Do you think I'm delusional? You can see it too. Millions of amateur astronomers have seen it. Here's a time lapse. Put another link. What do you think causes this? if not the mass of the planet pulling on the mass of the moons. And another key component of science you seem to completely ignore is predictability. Using Kepler's laws, we can accurately predict these orbits, any orbits. How do you think we can do that if the laws are not correct, and the explanation of gravity is wrong? This observation also confirms the inverse square law.
The predictions of retrograde motion of the wandering stars or the apparent orbital motion of the so-called moons of the wandering stars are based on observations, careful, meticulous observations over time, which are studied and happen to occur in predictable cycles. One decent analogy is involving solar and lunar eclipses, which they both occur on regular intervals, predictable cycles. So it is not the calculations of geniuses at using their gravitational constant to predict orbital cycles, but instead it is simply hundreds and hundreds of years, and really dating back to thousands of years. The ancient cultures like the ancient Egyptians and the Maya and all of these ancient cultures, the ancient Chinese, were extremely astute astronomers, and they had developed charts, calendars in terms of the Maya that span many, many tens of thousands of years, very, very accurately. And they were meticulous star watchers, the ancient Greeks as well. And throughout time, there are even documented cases of seeing the so-called moons of Jupiter with the naked eye, which again, is just so strictly impossible in heliocentric cosmology, where Jupiter is so distant and relatively small compared to the distance involved, let alone its moons. But it is the study and observation of the cyclical phenomenon that allow us to predict the future of the phenomenon, because we've seen these repeating cycles so many times before in terms of orbital patterns, and we've used matrices ranging from geostationary, geocentric, globe theories to geocentric flat Earth theories, and it's the heavenly bodies are simply predictable as long as you pay attention and meticulously document your observations over long time periods. Once you see repeating cycles and confirm repeating cycles, another example would be the analemma of the sun. That's a repeating cycle that you could observe over time and realize that it happens as a consistent repeating cycle. Just because we make meticulous observations and assign them mathematical values, then predict these cyclical observations by simply using the mathematical values that we've given to them, doesn't mean that the mathematics is what proved the cycle. The cycle must have been observed first, and the mathematics are constructed around that. Do you understand the difference? This is the case with all of the heavenly bodies, and if you really think about this in a heliocentric sort of sense, that really doesn't jive well with it, because you must understand our angles towards visible space and our angles in the sun's relative path around the galaxy and the galaxy's alleged trajectory, along with all of the other stars and galaxies' alleged motion, and yet not one single star has ever changed its relative position to one another. So, the entire heliocentric cosmology is really very quite nonsensical to every extent.
This observation also confirms the inverse square law. The closer moons orbit faster than the further moons. 3. Lab experiments show that gravity works on all objects with mass, not just the Earth. You put another link. 4. Gravity waves from black holes were famously detected this year.
in a video which I actually debunked. And isn't it convenient that gravity was discovered, proved this year, since it's supposedly been a known fact for thousands of years, yet it was just now proven conveniently this year. Makes a lot of sense.
You claim black holes have tremendous mass and therefore tremendous gravity. You put yet another link. So, why do you think that the giant mass of the Earth could not be responsible for the pull of gravity? Lots of evidence confirms it, and it works exactly the same wherever we observe it in the universe.
See, here's where I think you're totally missing the boat on pretty much everything. You believe that theories and assumptions are laws. So you believe that gravity is a law, and so it's beyond your capability to see because of the matrix or the lens through which you've been trained to view reality. It's impossible for you to separate the concept of gravity with what goes up must come down, as well as orbits. Now, I'm sure you're probably aware of this, but there are lots of problems with gravity. It is such a weak force, so scientists have a hard time explaining how they're able to connect, massive distant objects such as, the Earth to the Sun or the Sun to the galactic center, when the only material or the only medium that such gravitational waves would have to propagate through is essentially, in your model, nothing. It's a vacuum, it's a void. And so I was being facetious earlier when I said that an infinite vacuum, clearly makes for great structural and tensile building materials, because a vacuum can do no sort of thing. The main point is you have this very firm, unshakable belief in infinite space, in spherical Earths, and gravity, and all of that, that it is literally impossible for you to see the plain, simple truth, because your mind is rejecting what's being presented to you very clearly as bad data, because it conflicts with everything that you've been reared to believe. And that's human nature. It's a sort of self-defense mechanism. However, the truth will set you free.
If the mass of the Earth is responsible for the pull of gravity, then there's no reason to think that a spherical Earth would not pull objects toward the center of the Earth. And if that's the case, lots of your problems with the globe go away. Also, you claim that gravity is just caused by density and buoyancy, but this makes no sense. The direction of the pull is always down. How does a dense object always go down no matter which way it's pointing? How does density and buoyancy convey that downward direction? They can't.
You claim.
There has to be a force pulling downward in the downward direction. Without that, it would have to have some way to detect which way is down. How do you imagine that happens?
Okay, so I agree with you 100% that in order for density and buoyancy to work in either model, that you have to have some fundamental downward tendency for higher density objects. Barometric pressure plays a huge role in our weight on a scale, as well as decreased barometric pressure will change the boiling point of water. I'm sure you know all this. But absolutely 100% agreed that you need to have a downward tendency. An actual study into both of these models over the last, into the heliocentric model for 30 years, and into the flat geostationary geocentric flat Earth model, which is not a disk in outer space, but is the physical plane, and space as you understand it is merely a secondary feature to the world. So that's one big fundamental misunderstanding that a lot of people have when approaching flat Earth. You try to bring globe Earth infinite space cosmology with you to the table to scrutinize flat Earth. However, the two cosmologies are mutually exclusive and completely different altogether. In terms of the downward tendency to fundamentally allow for density and buoyancy to work on a plane that's not spinning, it's not flying through space, but is absolutely stationary. The extent of this plane is as yet unknown. Again, it could extend to infinity. The infinite plane could extend to infinity, or it could drop off an edge at any point up to and including infinity. So we just simply don't know. No person has ever circumnavigated the South Pole. The only person that's ever came close that we know of that's documented, that's, I'm sure that there are lots of sort of black ops military sort of situations going south of the South Pole, but the only case on historical record, besides the Nazis, which is a little bit, that's another story, but in terms of U.S. Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Now, if you believe the U.S. military propaganda, which, I'm not sure I want to believe this hook, line, and sinker, but in the 1950s, Byrd had done several Arctic excursions and Antarctic excursions, and so finally they did the mother of them all, which was called Operation High Jump, where they took several thousand personnel, aircraft carriers, the whole nine. It was a major Navy mission, and what they did was essentially, because when you get to Antarctica, you essentially have to scale an ice wall that's, or at least in the direction that they were going, which they had 3 teams which came from different directions. You can look into it. I'm not going to give you all of the details of the expedition, but at the end of the day, they had to. The reason they call it high jump is they had to scale this, several 100-foot wall above the water, several, mile deep iceberg, or just wall of permanent compressed ice. They had to first get on top of it and then launch an airplane, which Admiral Byrd himself flew solo, and he went south from Little America and continued south. And he went well past where anyone had ever gone before, and apparently well past anywhere anyone has gone since. Now, what he claimed to have found, and what other, because they allegedly, or they claim to have did some surveying and some readings for natural resources and that sort of thing, but they found warm freshwater lakes. They found, Byrd claimed to have found a landmass south of the South Pole from Little America that was larger than the American continent. Okay, so if you try to place this map, if you try to map this out on a globe, if there were a continent larger than the American continents south of the South Pole, well, then that would mean it would be somewhere in the southern hemisphere. It would be an unknown continent in a globe Earth model, and we should know about it, right? But in a flat Earth model where the plane could continue on and there could be other worlds or other geothermal solar systems, for lack of a better term, fairly close by. I mean, this is a real possibility, and in fact, it does give motive for the Antarctic Treaty, which was put into place just after Operation High Jump, in fact. And just a couple years later, NASA was formed, and the Russian space race began. So what happened was, clearly, that they found things worth of value in the Antarctic, which is an entire untapped continent, at least in the globe model. In the flat Earth model, it's a huge, massive, vast expanse of land that's untapped. And according to Byrd, it's rich in all sorts of natural resources like coal and oil and uranium, probably gold and platinum, and everything else that you find in the earth when you dig it up. So Byrd predicted that it would be a very attractive place for corporate activity and, I guess vacationing. Now, globe earthers claim that it would be impossible to patrol an area as wide around as the Antarctic as claimed in the sort of azimuthal equidistant projection, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's a pretty good, way to describe one flat Earth model that I believe works well enough. But the point is that they wouldn't have to patrol the entire circumference of the Earth. They would really only have to patrol the areas that are, conducive to traveling to Antarctica, which would be the southern tip of South America, the southern portion of Australia, and of course the southern portion of the African continents. From really anywhere else, it's going to be extremely difficult to get to Antarctica unless you're like some billionaire with a, yacht that can go for years without refueling because, by the way, it's illegal to bring or store fuel beyond the 60 degrees south, according to the Antarctic Treaty. But the point is, they wouldn't have to patrol the entire area. They would only really have to focus on 3 key areas, and with today's technology and assuming that the assorted military powers of the world have covertly taken over the Antarctic continent and are indeed out there in violation of the Antarctic Treaty, as it is supposed to be reserved strictly for scientific research. But what they do is they take, if you want to go to the Antarctic, they take you to a specific location where you're not allowed to do much free roaming, and then you go back. Not only has the Antarctic never been circumnavigated longitudinally, but has also never been circumnavigated latitudinally, so from east to west. That is because the Earth isn't a sphere; it's a stationary plane. The entire point to this diatribe was what really happened is that whatever Admiral Byrd found down there, the governments of the world wanted to keep it a secret from the public. That is 100% for certain. They all signed off on the Antarctic Treaty. I think it began with 32 nations, and it's now currently up to 50 some odd nations that have signed it. Many of which, actually all of the nations that have space programs are members of the Antarctic Treaty. So this is a huge sort of cordoning off of an entire, continent at the bottom of the globe in the spherical Earth model, and it's a cordoning off of the outer circumference of the world map in the flat Earth model, right? So what this amounts to is really quite despicable when you think about it. Think about all of the energy crises that we've been through. We've basically funded the very people who we claim, or who the government claims to have attacked us on 9/11, by purchasing their oil from them, not using our vast resources of oil to enrich our nation, but allowing like the Kuwaitis and the Saudis to get extremely rich off of purchasing oil from them and paying tons of money to ship it, and have all these wars over oil fields and all this, when the whole entire time, not to mention all of the natural disasters, all of the oil spills, all underwater debacle that happened in the Gulf of Mexico that lasted for many months, and I think it still has issues leaking. So all of these issues with drilling for oil, near to our beaches and such, that are allegedly running dry, and we've got this huge and astronomically huge, depending on which model you choose, resource that you'd think that any wise government or anybody worried about the environment would tap into this vast untouched resource, and it is totally doable with today's technology. If corporations wanted to, and I believe they are probably out there in violation of the Antarctic Treaty, but in the flat Earth model, who would ever catch them? The area is so large. You really have to think about this logically. Why would the most untouched resource that doesn't host any sort of wildlife except for some penguins? There's not a whole lot of fish when you get that far south. The waters become less and less salinous, extremely cold. The ice is inhospitable. If you can get over the ice wall that appears to be all over the place at the Antarctic, then there's mountainous terrain beyond that. So it's a place that's not going to affect any local ecosystems, and as long as it was drilled or mined responsibly, it would be the solution to so many of the world's problems. Now, even though we don't need coal and we don't need petroleum, which is not made out of fossils, it's not made out of dead dinosaurs and amoeba. That's a lie. But we don't need any of that stuff because in the 40s, Nikola Tesla discovered that we can simply harness energy from the atmosphere itself. There is a static electric charge to the Earth, and for every meter that you go up from the Earth, the electric potential increases. So that's why Tesla towers were built very, very tall. And he figured out in the 40s you could harness electricity for free and also broadcast signals all over the world, as well as broadcast energy that could literally power planes in flight. But broadcast, is just one thing, and we can thank Nikola Tesla for all of radio frequency communications technologies that we have. However, people like J.P. Morgan and Thomas Edison didn't want Nikola Tesla's version of free energy coming out, and so they created a system where it's pay to play. And I'm sure that you cringe if you have to pay a power bill, unless I'm not sure if you pay your own bills or not. But if you have to pay a $200 or $300 power bill, then you know exactly what I'm talking about, and that's exactly what Nikola Tesla wanted to avoid. And the point of this entire diatribe is that the electrostatic charge of the Earth and the known electric potential proportional with altitude is conducive to this ultimate downward tendency that you're looking for. You call it gravity caused by a warping of space-time of the non-spherical Earth, when in fact it is simply an electrostatic charge. Now, an electrostatic charge that is causing dense objects to tend downward and less dense objects or liquids to tend upward. That is your downward tensity that you need, and it makes perfect sense. Gravity has never been proven. The LIGO interferometer was bull. That did not prove gravity. I'm sorry. If gravity were an actual thing, it would be abundantly clear. But the electrostatic charge of the Earth and the electric potential when you gain in altitude, even it's per meter, so some 1,000 volts per meter. I'm not sure. It's something like that. But that is the downward tendency that you need.
Now, finally, the next thing I'm going to point to is a demonstration of how an electrostatic charge can indeed and will attract matter. Because you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm not made out of metal, so I shouldn't be affected by, magnetic forces, right? that is a little bit naive, seeing how we're talking about an electrostatic charge, not a magnetic force. We are made mostly of water, full of electrolytes, and our bodies, especially our brains, run on electrical impulses, and our body reacts to electrical signals sent to our extremities, for example. So we are extremely susceptible to electromagnetic fields, electricity, and even a static electric charge. And it doesn't matter whether you hold a positive or a negative charge. An electrostatic charge will always be an attractant, or it will never be a repelling force. If you do the research into this, an electrostatic charge that the Earth possesses, and if you look at this TV, you can see, if you remember the olden days, if you didn't have a good signal, you'd get that sort of black and white, fuzzy, loud noised channel. And what you were picking up was literally the electrostatic charge of the Earth. And it is these very signals that digital communications use to transmit data via radio frequency waves. They're just using the existing matrix that is generated by the Earth itself. So much like the old cathode ray tube televisions that produced and held an electrostatic charge, so too does the Earth. And you find an increasing electric potential proportional with altitude. This perfectly explains the fundamental matrix that allows for density and buoyancy to work, and it's what causes what goes up must come down. Now, I don't think that we can call an electrostatic charge gravity, because they're two different things. I mean, you can call it whatever you want. A rose by any other name is none less beautiful, right? But gravity is technically a lie, and we can demonstrate electromagnetism and electrostatic charges, but you can never demonstrate mass being attracted to mass. The Cavendish experiment is the only one of its kind in history that claims to have detected large, massive lead balls somehow being attracted to each other, which there's so many explanations for that. But if you want to go and try and find, better yet, do an experiment, go to the side of a really the most massive building you should find. Technically, that should generate, a little bit of gravity, right? Will a feather stick to the side of that building? No. What if that building were spinning? Would anything stick to the side of it? Now, if that building had an electrostatic charge, then dust particles and stuff would stick to it.
Here's a very, very simple experiment. Fill a plastic bottle with water and put a marble and a cork in it and cap it. The marble will go to the bottom and the cork to the top. This is due to the relative densities. The marble pushes water out of the way to get to the bottom, and the water pushes the cork up because it is more dense, so it forces the cork up. That is how density and buoyancy work. But they only work because there is a downward force called gravity. If they worked without gravity, then you could turn the bottle and they would stay in the same spots in the bottle, but they don't. No matter which way you turn the bottle, the marble will move to the lowest spot closest to the earth and the cork to the highest spot. That happens because there is a downward force. I really cannot imagine how you can deny that. It's so obvious, so easy to test, and yet you say it is not proven. What the hell do you mean?
Okay, so I think I've pretty well covered what the hell I mean, but you're just using your whole bottle, and I submit that you should put a cork in it. Well, I'm just kidding. But that whole experiment is just yet another demonstration of density and buoyancy. It's a demonstration of higher density objects finding their way down, lower density objects relatively finding their way up, and that is the natural order of things. Now, you claim that this downward tendency is caused by gravity, and again, gravity is a theory that has never been proven, and no, LIGO did not conveniently prove it last year by detecting a 3.5 billion year old. Two black holes allegedly merging into one black hole 3.5 billion years ago. And then they convinced themselves that that's what that signal was, which again, as time went forward, the signal went up. Therefore, they detected gravity waves. I call bull crap on that. And you can watch a couple of my videos that I did cover that. But again, I've already quoted it pretty much verbatim, exactly what they did. They showed two real computer simulations, not one, but two real computer simulations of data that they extrapolated and made a cartoon for you, and that's all that was. So gravity remains to be proven, and in fact, we don't need the theory of gravity. This is the big point that I think you fail to see, is that since the Earth isn't a spinning sphere, then we theoretically don't even need anything like gravity for what goes up must come down. Okay, so I'm literally just besides myself because I was yet again trying to make a reply to one of Voice of Reason's comments to my response video to his original video, and as you can see here, I took a screen capture, screen animation capture, whatever you want to call it, of me trying to post a response on a comment in a thread on my own video on my own channel on YouTube. I've never seen this before, ever. I'm just wondering, is there some way that Voice of Reason is commenting on my channel and yet blocks me from replying to him? I don't think that's possible. So like, I don't want to just block you, right? Assuming that's the case, because I don't even think such a thing is possible on YouTube, right? So anyway, I'm gonna have to do yet another video response to one of your comments that you made, and I'll just go ahead and include it in here. We might as well, I've got all the time in the flat world. So the comment was again on this same video as I'd mentioned. It was the Thanksgiving special mega debunking of Voice of Reason, and I'll go ahead and start with your comment. Quote,
At 2830, you say curvature and axial rotation are never observed.
Wrong.
My video explains how the horizon reveals the curvature. Plus, the curvature has been measured for more than a century using geodesic surveying techniques, as demonstrated and explained here. https://youtube.be/ I'll put the link in there.
It's a dead link to a video that doesn't exist that you put there. However, I'll continue.
And the axial rotation is easily observed by watching the stars rotate each night around two celestial poles, which I explain in my part 2. This is one of those things I mean by cherry picking. You ignore obvious evidence and make blatant statements that there is no evidence where there is.
End quote. So, since I'm unable to reply to your comments on my own videos on my own channel, I'll just go ahead and read my response. So, the link you provided, as I mentioned, is a dead link, so that doesn't score any points, doesn't make any sense. Then you claim at 2830, you actually misquote me, either to deceive others or simply because you don't understand the point. Your totally fallacious paraphrasing was, quote, you say curvature and axial rotation are never observed, end quote. Now, that is a lie, and I never said that, ever, and I didn't say it at 2830 or anywhere near that in the video, never said it ever. So, what I said, and here I'll paraphrase accurately, was inverse square curvature of the overall surface of the Earth and axial rotation of the Earth as a whole have never been conclusively proven. Now, there's a difference between observation, as you've stated, and theories to explain the observation and conclusive proof that the theory is correct. You should probably retract your deceptive misquote and apologize for lying about what I said. That was plainly in the video, and if anyone cares to look at 2830 in that video, I didn't say anything of the sort that axial rotation and curvature have not been observed. And, actually, I could actually say that. I think the proper way to say it, though, however, would be curvature and axial rotation have always been assumed, and due to confirmation bias coupled with these assumptions, it turns them into observations, fallacious observations, because the human mind is not exactly perfect like a computer. If you put bad data into a computer, you're going to get bad data back in the results, or if there's some sort of flaw in the programming or coding of the computer program, then it's going to spit out bad data even if you put in good data. So confirmation bias and theories to support your pre-existing worldview or preconceived notions are a witch's brew, if you understand what I mean. So anyway, there's a difference between an observation, theories to explain the observation, and conclusive proof that the theory is correct. You should probably retract your deceptive misquote and apologize for lying about what I said. Your claim that the horizon proves curvature is an oxymoron. The word horizon is literally derived from the word horizontal, or actually it's vice versa. I actually checked the etymology. In fact, the word horizontal was derived from the concept of the horizon itself. Go figure. So horizontal is defined as, quote, parallel lines to the plane of the horizon at right angles to the vertical. In other words, a straight line across the x-axis of an observer's vision. Now, were the Earth indeed a sphere, you would need to look further and further down at decreasing angles proportionally with the vertical ascent to have a line of sight towards the horizon, which would necessarily drop lower and lower, apparently to an observer gaining altitude. Now, we have tons of footage from weather balloons exceeding 100,000 feet, including the famous Red Bull jump over New Mexico by Felix Baumgartner. I believe he reached a peak altitude of 137,000 feet before jumping, if I'm not mistaken, could be off, but it was above 100,000 feet. Pretty damn high to jump. Now, during the footage of this highest base jump ever, when the forward hatch is popped open, like before he gets out and stands there, you can clearly see from the camera within the capsule the horizon directly in front of the camera at eye level. This would be impossible on a spherical Earth due to the angles involved. Like the camera was way back in the capsule. The capsule was a sort of a small little porthole from the angle of the camera, and there, right in the middle, right at dead center, was the horizon. So it was almost as if the horizon had not dropped one fraction of a degree at over 100,000 feet. Now, again, this single observation is very bad for the heliocentric model or the spherical Earth model because the horizon remains fixed at eye level regardless of altitude and appears as an equidistant circle around the observer. This is based on altitude and the density of the atmosphere around you. Now, when you're up at 100,000 feet, you see the horizon differently than when you're down in the troposphere when you're surrounded by blue sky. When you're up at 100,000 feet, you're sort of looking down at an angle to the blue sky, right? And the density of the atmosphere above it does not reflect and is not perturbed by sunlight in such a way so that it glows blue as a solid sapphire. Right? So the atmosphere becomes blue and opaque and even reflective and refractive at different distances relative subjectively to an observer. The horizon being an equidistant circle around you at 100,000 feet, that, can be mathematically figured out. I'm not going to do it in this reply, but the atmosphere plays a huge role in this, and you see a cutoff point, right, where it seems like the Earth, the flat Earth curved equidistant circle all around you is the horizon, but it's flat. You've got some sort of gradient of grays, and then the blackness of what appears to be space. And this really is sort of it tricks your brain, or if you already believe the Earth is a globe, you believe that's where the globe curves off and it's space. But you're actually looking at a plane down at an angle upon a plane where the atmosphere is very thick and opaque at those distances. However, at a certain level, the atmosphere is not perturbed by sunlight to turn blue and opaque. It appears as if the Earth falls away and space begins. But what you're actually seeing is, again, it's atmospheric refraction, and you're seeing the different layers of you've got the troposphere and different layers of density, types of molecules, of gases in different layers, which cause light to behave differently as light passes through these different layers. The electromagnetic waves coming from the stars and the sun are not visible until they pass through these layers of our atmosphere. So there's a good hypothesis that we're trying to test, that during the nighttime, if you get up high enough and look straight up in a weather balloon, that you won't see any stars, simply because that light, you may see it in the infrared or in some millimeter wavelength, right? But that light from the stars and even the sun, when you get up high enough, when you're in space, when there is essentially no atmosphere to speak of, it's not a vacuum, there's just no atmosphere to speak of, the electromagnetic waves emanating from these sources have not diffused into the visible light spectrum. And so that it creates all sorts of optical illusions that really can trick a person into thinking the Earth is a globe. I mean, it's very convincing when you're brought up in that matrix that the Earth is a globe. Now, getting back to the high jump, they all not only did they have the camera in the capsule, but they also had cameras set up outside the capsule attached to a weather balloon. The whole thing was attached to a helium balloon. But they used trick photography on the exterior cameras, looking towards Felix before he jumped. They used, GoPro fisheye lenses to create the illusion of a curved horizon. The problem is, if you actually look at this objectively, according to this very misleading footage, New Mexico apparently takes up about 40% of the spherical Earth, right? So we must live on one small-ass ball for New Mexico to take up such an overwhelming portion of the sphere. If you think this argument isn't used by globe heads, think again. When I debated a Harvard graduate doctorate in astrophysics, teaches at Harvard, he's on multiple advisory boards to NASA. I debated with Dr. Josh Grindley on the Art Bell show, Midnight in the Desert, back in August of last year. And this Dr. Josh Grindley actually tried to use the example of the Red Bull Felix Baumgartner jump as proof of the curvature of the Earth, if you can actually believe that. Now, when I told him immediately after him making this claim, because I'm well familiar with the jump and the trick photography, that they were using fisheye lenses to cause an illusion of curvature, him and the impartial host of the debate both snickered at me and mocked me. However, the cameras were indeed GoPro fisheye lenses. Now, if you care to know the outcome of the debate, I actually won the debate, if you score it properly, against Dr. Josh Grindley and Art Bell as a horrible mediator who was completely biased and bent towards the good doctor who was operating way below his pay grade, according to Art Bell. Now, if you care to know the outcome of the debate, I actually won the debate against Dr. Josh Grindley, even though the opponent was extremely arrogant, ignorant, and on NASA's payroll. And, of course, Art Bell, the mediator of the debate, was favoring Dr. Grindley to such a degree that I believe he even gave him a blowjob during the debate. The fact is, the horizon line does not fall away as you increase in altitude. The horizon line does not vertically drop away as you increase in altitude, but instead it gracefully rises with the eye of the observer to all known recorded heights obtained by normal people, as opposed to government agencies who have been lying about space since 1958. Only the Freemasonic, Luciferian, Nazi administrators and astronauts during the fledgling stages of NASA's beginnings have claimed to see the curvature of the Earth. And they use trick photography historically, and more recently CGI, to fake space and trick everyone into believing the Earth is a sphere. All of the Apollo astronauts were indeed Freemasons. Project Paperclip brought thousands of Nazi scientists over to the U.S. after World War II to spearhead NASA, which was, it was a rocket space exploration program on the surface, but more importantly, it was a psychological operation as its true purpose. Now, Werner von Braun is just one example of Nazis that were spearheading NASA during its fledgling years, but there were literally thousands of Nazi scientists involved with the creation of NASA. Now, I'm not necessarily demonizing Nazis. I'm certainly not demonizing Jews. I'm an eighth German, and my wife's half Jewish, so I don't have any dog in this fight. I think that what happened during World War II was terrible. My grandfather and 4 of his brothers fought in that war, and I don't want to get into all that. The point is, during those times, right after World War II was still in very recent memory, if the United States people knew that the U.S. government was using the rat lines, illegally immigrating Nazi scientists, some of them very high level, some of them allegedly guilty of war crimes if you believe the mainstream narrative, whatever the case, they did this secretly behind the American people's backs. Because I believe that the Nazis did have far superior technological capabilities, but more importantly, they had far superior psychological capabilities. And in fact, prior to the war, the Nazis and the Germans in the United States were very closely related in terms of scientific studies. The whole eugenics program, the U.S. and the Nazis and the Germans were very much, co-opting on that sort of thing, which is very extremely nefarious stuff. I mean, if you really want to know the truth, if you look into that sort of thing and look into its offshoots, such as Planned Parenthood, it's a systematic culling of certain bloodlines, breeding out certain types of people, and breeding in or allowing to prevail other certain types of people. So it's essentially, what they did for a number of years, even in America, was they would sterilize people, so they couldn't reproduce if they had unfavorable traits, and this was supposed to be a social benefit that would ensure that we have a cream of the crop gene pool. And as you know, the Nazis were very much into this sort of thing as well. The royal families are extremely into this to the point of inbreeding, and the fact is you need a robust gene pool, and even with all of its flaws, there are deformities and things, but there must be a reason for all that. It could be there's lots of reasons for that. This is way besides the point. The main point is that the Americans and the Nazis were very much allied prior to World War II. The Americans did not want to get into the war with the Nazis ostensibly, and it was the false flag of Pearl Harbor that brought the Americans into the war, which is a whole nother story. However, the Allies ended up winning. Hitler achieved exactly what the Zionists wanted, which was a nation state in Israel, smack in the middle of Palestine, in ancient Israel, and they wanted it done essentially overnight. They wanted to give the average Jewish person who had been up to World War II living very comfortably and doing very well for themselves in the German society. Those people did not want to move to Palestine in the desert where people, didn't really like each other, and so the Zionists needed a reason to give their own people, who were mingling with the Goyim and breeding with Germans and such. They wanted to give their own people an incentive to populate Israel for safe haven. And what better incentive could you give somebody than to lock them up in internment camps? Now, I've come to the conclusion, based on my research, that the Holocaust camps, lots of people died there, but they were not murder camps. They were work camps, and I know for a fact that during the final few weeks and months of the war, the United States and allies decimated the German supply lines all across all of their territories. My grandfather actively participated in this, and he actually told me many stories about how they had a lot of fun getting all of their equipment and men across key bridges and then demolishing the bridges. And if they needed to cross again, they would build pontoon bridges. So that was the sort of thing that they did, but they destroyed all of their bridges, they destroyed all of their railways, they crippled their infrastructure, right? And so what happened was on the periphery and all of these obscure areas around the vast German territory at that time, you had these work camps where Jewish people and other races were kept as collateral. That's one of the most important strategic things to have during a war is collateral. And the stupidest thing you could possibly do is kill your collateral by the millions. And as history unfolds, it appears that's not what happened. What appears happened is that the weeks, or even just 2 weeks, or say 3 weeks, where all of the German infrastructure had been decimated, Berlin was being invaded, whatever happened to Hitler was happening. During this time frame, the people in the concentration camps, the work camps, starved to death, and they were totally sick with typhoid fever, which is deadly unless treated with antibiotics. And so I think that the Zionists and the powers that ought not be had coordinated this from a much higher level than we understand. I believe that the German people and the United States have been allies before World War II. During World War II, case in point would be Prescott Bush dealing with the enemy, trading with the enemy during wartime. And Prescott Bush, by the way, is the grandfather of one U.S. president and a father of another U.S. president, both named George Bush, right? Much like this continual relationship between the United States and Germany, there has also been a continual relationship between the United States and Russia. Remember, we were close allies, Russia and us, United States, during World War II. And in fact, the Russians lost many, many millions of people during that war. And in fact, the work camps in Russia were terrible conditions, and lots of people died there as well. But upwards of 25 million people died on the Russian side of that conflict, which dwarfs the claimed 6 million. However, again, and this is just my point of view based on my knowledge of the war and firsthand knowledge of people who were in that war. My grandfather, who told me lots of his own personal stories of that war, that anybody living in an outskirt area, once your supply chains are broken, you're not going to survive there very long, especially without antibiotics, food. By the time we got there, they were starving and dying of typhus. Right. So another example that I mentioned was Satanists founding NASA. And just one example, you had people like Jack Parsons, or the founder of Jet Propulsion's Laboratory, or JPL, who were always an integral partner with NASA and helped kick off NASA. But yeah, he was a known occultist and Satanist at the top level. Then there's tons of them in NASA and in most government agencies, actually, as well as NASA's partner groups, such as JPL. Now, there's plenty of motive for this great deception, if that's what you're asking yourself, but that's a separate topic altogether, and I have made videos about that. Check that out, Earth Not a Globe 3. You've already slung mud at the observation of the fully visible Chicago skyline from across a body of water of about 60 miles away, meaning the base of the building should be 2,165 feet beneath the horizon line, which is 57 squared times 0.66666. The tallest building in Chicago is the Willis Tower, which stands about 1,450 feet tall. This means that the tip top of the Willis Tower should have been buried beneath 715 feet of the allegedly curved horizon. Curvizon, right? So you will try to explain this away as a mirage or with atmospheric refraction, I know. But these phenomena do not account for the plainly visible cityscape at 60 miles away, which is clearly directly across a plane of water. Period. There is no inverse square dropping away of that water. It's level. Get it? I strongly suggest you check out Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe, because it is a good piece, although I don't agree with everything in it, but specifically because it was written during a time prior to NASA, using the Zetetic process, which is the most ideal form of the scientific method, and it is far more practical a process than theoretical physics to discern the actual truth. Theoretical physics fills in unknown values with assumptions, theories, and conjecture, which is fine, but at some point you must prove those assumptions, theories, and conjecture, otherwise you don't have proof of anything, you just have a theory. Now, the zetetic process is derived from the Greek word zeteo. It means to proceed only according to inquiry. Ergo, an unknown variable must be dealt with logically and practically, as opposed to filling in the blanks of unknown variables with theory, assumption, and conjecture, which just so happens to be inherently aligned with your worldview. That is not science, that is confirmation bias. Now, this clusterfuck of confirmation bias, crafting theories which cannot be tested, demonstrated, repeated, or falsified, is the definition of pseudoscience as well. Theoretical astrophysics literally equals pseudoscience and confirmation bias. Now, I promise you that if you can set the globe down for skeptical scrutiny and compare that with the actual flat Earth model, and spend some time really getting to understand the different views on the flat Earth model, because there are lots of theories being kicked around, one thing's for certain, the Earth is not a spinning sphere. Now, I promise you that if you actually give this topic a fair shake, spend some time getting your head wrapped around all of this coherently, it becomes painfully obvious that the Earth is not a spinning ball, unfortunately. It's extremely difficult to reach this conclusion fully, as all our lives, entire lives, have been constructed around fallacious belief systems involving the big coincidence bang theory, or the theory of gravity as a warping of theoretical space-time, etc. ad nauseum. which all of this everyone was forced to believe since we were gullible toddlers. And I think that you, voice of reason, are smart enough to reach the obvious, doubtless, indisputable conclusion that the Earth could not possibly be a spinning sphere in outer space. However, you must painstakingly re-examine all of your assumptions and preconceived notions that you were programmed to believe about the world and about the universe. Axial rotation is assumed by observing the stars. That is the only observation that can be explained. That is the only observation which leads people to believe that we're spinning at all. Now, this observation, I believe, or I know, can be explained in three different ways. One, the Earth is stationary and the stars are spinning. Two, the stars are stationary and the Earth is spinning. That's what you believe. And three, the Earth is stationary, the stars are stationary, not physical objects, but sources of light which are also stationary. While the sources of light are invisible, only the visible spectrum electromagnetic waves filtering through our atmosphere plane are visible. However, those sources of light are stationary as well as the Earth being stationary, and it is the ether and or the electromagnetic vortex enveloping the stationary flat Earth that is spinning, causing light waves or electromagnetic waves to appear to spin along with the natural electromagnetic flux lines caused by the magnetic vortex in the central north. I think you should probably look into an experiment or several. One of them is Airy's failure. Another would be Michelson-Morley, Michelson-Gale, and the Sagnac experiments. You can look into those, but probably the most easy to understand, and I think that is the most profound, because it's simple. I like simple proofs, and this is as simple as dealing with light waves and telescopes and water in the telescopes can be. But Airy's failure was an experiment which was intended to prove that the Earth is spinning. However, it proved, much to Airy's dismay, that it was indeed the inbound light from the stars that were apparently in motion or spinning, while the Earth itself is at rest. Now, physical experiments also prove there is no axial rotation. If you fire a cannonball perfectly vertical on a still day, the ball will always land within a few feet of the cannon, and in many cases it will land directly into the barrel of the cannon that fired it. Now, regardless of what you believe, the cannonball should always apparently head west, most dramatically on its way down, head west. During the path straight up, the cannonball might retain some of its angular momentum lent to it by the hypothetically spinning Earth. However, with each meter in altitude gained, the ball would need to travel slightly faster and slightly faster east, proportionally with altitude, to keep up with the cannon fixed below it, which is fixed to the Earth, rotating along a static radius, while the cannonball would be traveling east at an increasing radius, which means it would have to travel faster and faster east in order to keep up with this point down here, which makes absolutely no sense in your model. Now, at its peak altitude, the cannonball would theoretically, on a spinning ball, have lost any eastward angular momentum lent to it by the Earth prior to being fired out of the cannon at extreme velocities. And this cannonball couldn't possibly accelerate eastward as it gains altitude to maintain the exact frame of reference with the ground and the cannon beneath. Now, let's not forget that the cannonball would also need to decelerate back to its original eastward velocity prior to being fired in order to land anywhere near the cannon that fired it. In other words, at its highest point in the ball's trajectory, it would necessarily be traveling faster towards the east than the cannon below, as it must be traveling across a greater arc relative to the cannon fixed to the Earth, hence fixed to a static axis of rotation. This is all overlooking one of the fundamental laws of motion, which must not be ignored, which states an object in motion will tend to maintain its velocity until enacted upon by some other force. Now, would you consider a ball being shot from the barrel of a cannon as a result of an explosion compressed within the barrel of that cannon some other force? Of course you would.
Oh, I see that one. That one's coming straight down. You know, a little over this way. Oh! That was awesome.
What this means is there's a difference between a rotating object fixed to a larger body, a larger host body as a fixed frame of reference. If an object is simply released from that rotating frame of reference, such as, spinning around your string and letting it go, then it more or less travels at a 90-degree angle to the axis of rotation, but it does maintain its angular momentum or its eastward frame of reference. However, when you're dealing with a cannonball being shot from the barrel of a cannon as a result of a compressed explosion inside of the barrel of the cannon, there's an extremely massive amount of force applied to the cannonball, which puts it on a trajectory that would not be conducive to maintaining its angular momentum. So in other words, the force enacted upon it would force it to change its velocity from eastward to perpendicular to that, or at a right angle to that direction. So for people to argue that the cannonball would continue its if shot perfectly vertically from the equator, continue its perfect 1,037.5 mile per hour eastward trajectory while accelerating proportionally with altitude due to the fact that it must travel across a greater arc the higher it gets in order to maintain its position relatively above the cannon below, then decelerate back to its original eastward velocity as it comes back down into the barrel of the cannon that fired it. The point to all this is, again, revisiting some of the fundamental laws of motion, which I'll state it again: an object in motion will tend to maintain its velocity until enacted upon by some other force. So although the cannonball may have been spinning at 1,000 miles per hour prior to being fired, once it's fired, it's going to be forced in a direction contrary to that of the spin, and should therefore act as an independent body, moving away from the central axis of rotation at a much greater rate than it should when comparing its eastward velocity. And just for a little background information, the muzzle velocity, or the speed at which the cannonball is traveling right after it's fired, is alleged to be between 100 meters per second to 200 meters per second fired straight up, and then it would begin to obey the laws of density and buoyancy and hence begin to come back down. But just wanted to quickly mention that. By the way, 100 meters per second would be about 223 miles an hour, and 200 meters per second would be about 447 miles per hour. So if you're trying to imagine an Earth spinning around 1,000 miles an hour east, and then an object being jettisoned from that rotating frame of reference perpendicular to the axis of rotation at 223 miles, my point is it may retain some of its eastward or eastward angular momentum for some of its journey on the way up, although on its way back down, after it reaches the pinnacle and then becomes weightless, it should apparently begin to head extreme velocities towards the west. Now, of course, we all know that it isn't actually the ball that's traveling west, it's the stationary cannon that's fixed to the frame of reference with the ground that would be actually traveling east. But again, the ball would apparently travel west relative to the stationary observer. But again, this is all folly because every time a cannon or any sort of projectile is launched perfectly vertical into the air, you find that it comes straight back down.
Oh, I see that one. That one's coming straight down. You know, a little over this way. Oh! That was awesome.
Of course you would. You can do an experiment to prove that the cannonball would not continue on its eastward path with the cannon, not to mention accelerate eastward as it ascends, and decelerate westward on its way down to meet the ground with the original eastward velocity frame of reference prior to being fired, in order to land anywhere near the damned cannon that fired it, let alone directly back into the barrel of the cannon that fired it, which happens occasionally. Now, the experiment is pretty simple. Take a length of string, attach a small weight to the end of the string, spin the weight around holding the string with your fingers, and at any point of this spinning, let go of the string. Try letting it go so that the weight flies directly towards your face so that there's no doubt about the conclusion of this basic experiment involving a rotational frame of reference. Now, do you actually believe the weight that you're spinning around your hand will continue spinning around your hands as it did when you were holding the string spinning it? Of course it won't. The weight will travel at a right angle to the axis, maintaining some of its angular momentum depending on the force pushing the weight away from the axis. The greater the force pushing away from the axis, the less angular momentum will be retained. An extreme amount of force repelling the rotating weight from the center of the axis, the less angular momentum would be retained. An extreme force would cause the object to travel in a path away from the axis, and the object would not continue spinning around the axis once the force was exerted on the object, or once it was let go from the rotating body. So, of course, in this analogy, the weight represents the cannonball and the string represents the spinning earth. If you can follow the basic analogy, again, this is Physics 101 stuff. Now, we certainly can consider an explosion compress in the barrel of a cannon far greater force than simply releasing a string. Therefore, what should happen is the cannonball should slowly head apparently west during its ascent. At the peak of its path, the ball would temporarily be weightless and essentially motionless, as in the vomit comment, sort of. And any, at least with the weightlessness part, and any eastward angular momentum the ball may have retained during its ascent would be diminished greatly. In reality, this means the cannonball should head at extreme speeds, apparently west, depending on your latitude. Now, of course, it's going to be the continuous rotation of the ground beneath east, which causes the apparent heading of the cannonball west as it returns to the ground. Cannonballs fired directly vertically into the air should head far west from the point that they're fired if the Earth was a spinning sphere, especially the closer you get to the equator, the more obvious this would be. And this is, of course, because the axial rotation at the equator is alleged to be the supposedly ridiculous supersonic figure of 1,037.5 miles an hour. Right. On your second point, you have no idea what stars are. You believe that stars are performing the whimsical theoretical act of hot atomic fusion, which has never been demonstrated or proven. In fact, if you do the research, atomic bombs don't actually exist. Sounds crazy, look into it. The only thing harnessing the power of the atom really has going for it is nuclear power, as nuclear bombs are a hoax, and theoretical hot atomic fusion does not exist in reality. It only exists in the realm of theory. Now, nuclear power is a misnomer, as it is merely a complex version of steam power. A radioactive isotope, such as enriched uranium, are encased in a closed-off container which generates heat. That heat is transferred to boil water, creating steam, which is compressed to spin turbines exactly like a steam engine. The only difference is instead of burning coal to heat the water, you're manipulating radioactive isotopes to produce the necessary heat to create steam. There's nothing atomic about nuclear power. Nuclear power is a bullshit misnomer designed to reinforce people's belief that science has harnessed the power of the theoretical atom, when in fact the entire model of atoms is merely theoretical and an atom has never been observed ever. The point to this sidetrack is that you believe stars are suns trillions of miles away, when in fact there is no proof for this whatsoever. In fact, if you study the history of astronomy, none of the stars have moved relative to one another and have remained in their exact relative positions to one another for all of known history. This flies in the face of the big coincidence bang theory, where everything should theoretically be spreading apart at astronomical speeds. But geez, you haven't even looked at the Jeranism effect yet, or else you certainly would not adhere to the heliocentric model any longer, I promise you, if you look at this objectively. Since the stars are only visible during the nighttime, not daytime, equatorial stars overhead during the winter would be on the opposite end of the universe 6 months later, obscured by the bright blue sky. If we could observe one single equatorial star or constellation during the winter and summer from anywhere on Earth, the heliocentric model literally falls apart. I've made a few videos covering this topic in depth, and there are indeed countless equatorial stars and constellations visible from winter to summer, and the same goes for fall and spring. All year round, we can see these same stars visible overhead from the equator somewhere on Earth at night. To put this another way, equatorial stars 90 degrees over the head during the summer would be, say, northwest of the galactic equator. Since the Earth allegedly orbits the Sun at a 60-degree angle to the Sun's alleged path of orbit around the galaxy, then the winter equatorial stars 90 degrees overhead would necessarily be southeast of the galactic equator. And remember, in the summer they would have been northwest of the galactic equator. So we're talking about facing in opposite directions in the universe, and yet somehow we can see the same stars overhead from the equator. It's really rather simple when you think about it, but the fact that countless equatorial stars and constellations are indeed visible all year long from somewhere on Earth, this fully disproves the heliocentric model. I appreciate your position here, Voice of Reason. I truly do. And I'm sorry to say that the lights in the night sky are not what you've been led to believe, nor is the very Earth itself. Again, there's no way to convince you that the Earth isn't a globe spinning in the infinitude of galaxies and space. Obviously, you must do this for yourself by observing the heliocentric model honestly, objectively, and skeptically, which you obviously have not done yet, but you're on the right track because at least you're looking into this. But a real scientific study of this would be to try to disprove the heliocentric model, as that is one of the fundamental purposes of the scientific method. You should always try to disprove current models because that's how you progress scientifically. Now, of course, there are situations where you want to theorize, and that's fine, but again, at some point those theories must be confirmed and verified and proven. That is what makes a real scientific inquiry. Seeking out the truth, even if it means questioning your belief system. Hell, especially if it means questioning your belief system. One of the most difficult things for an intelligent person such as yourself to admit is the fact that you have been fooled big time. Starting from when you were too small and gullible to think for yourself. No offense, because I was right there with you a year and a half, 2 years ago. You probably don't remember, as most people don't, The first time you were told that you live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere by a very assertive adult, most children prior to the current age of propaganda, starting in the crib with cartoons, games, toys, movies, etc., preconditioning young children to accept the preposterous absurdity that is infinite space in the heliocentric model. Aliens, spaceships, Star Wars, all that good stuff. Prior to this extreme conditioning of the very young, most children growing up, I guess in the 70s and the 80s and prior to that. When I was growing up, I found, even at a very young age, that the concept of living stuck to the side of a spinning sphere is really ridiculous and completely illogical. Unfortunately, however, this worldview is forced upon us by our parents and teachers until we're programmed to believe all of it. Of course, your parents and teachers weren't lying, as they too were conditioned in much the same way that we all were. As gullible, defenseless toddlers, unable to think for ourselves or, debate an adult on astrophysics, right? Now, this includes every single person, from astrophysicists such as Neil deGrasse Tyson to, people flipping burgers at Burger King. I mean, this is what everyone was taught across the board, so it's not that difficult to keep the deception going when everyone believes it. Now, I hope that you're able to see the plain, simple truth for what it is. Once you get it, it's the most fascinating revelation in your entire life. Of that, I can assure you.
So with that ends my noble attempt to respond to Voice of Reason's comments on my own video, on my own channel no less. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so via PayPal to jonelance@gmail.com or through fan funding on YouTube. Thanks so much. Y'all spread the word, spread the world, and peace. Orbital host, which is physically impossible, but that's not even the point. If you actually believe this physical impossibility is true, however, like I said, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. I'm going to go even deeper into this topic just for a bit, just because I wanted a break from working on my next video, which I've actually just released. And of course, I'm making this video because YouTube would not allow me to post this comment that I'm verbally reading to you. So, in case you want multiple audio-visual presentations regarding the physical impossibility of orbital mechanics in a heliocentric model, I'll put a link to my playlist, The Fallacy of Gravity, as well as Disproving Orbital Motion, which could be very helpful for you if you pay attention. So now that we've established exactly what I mean by a third-generation satellite body, such as the moon, we'll quickly consider one single point which will demolish the idea of orbital mechanics in a heliocentric theory and in physical practice as well, as it is a fallacious ideology that couldn't possibly occur in reality. This is apparent if you honestly, skeptically analyze the claims made in the heliocentric model. Now, you claim the moon orbits the spherical Earth once per month. This means that during two adjacent half moons, about 13.5 days apart, you would have two totally opposite conditions which are supposedly caused by gravity, defined as a constant tug of war or dynamic tension between two objects depending on mass and density, proximity, velocity, with the vacuum of space as the theoretical tether between these two objects. Since the Earth is the greater of the two objects, you can practically say that the Earth is the greater source of gravity than the Moon. Of course, space-time is the tether between the two, because we all know an infinite vacuum makes for an excellent structural or tensile material, right? But only in your imagination-verse theory, of course. Now, all of that aside, during half moon A, which is due east of the Earth's path along the ecliptic, the Earth is supposedly traveling directly towards the moon at about 66,600 miles an hour.
The moon is less than 250,000 miles from the gravitationally rich Earth, a mere 3 hours, 45-minute journey for the Earth to reach the moon, in case you were wondering. Now, you believe it's the moon's speed and trajectory which allow for it to go well around the front of the Earth's path. Now, are you with me so far? Because I'm about to burst your bubble. Now, once the moon has reached the next half-moon phase, or the west side of the Earth half-moon phase, the Earth would be racing away from the moon at 66,600 miles an hour. So what must occur here in order for the moon to do a 180 turn in space, accelerate to speeds well faster than the Earth, to surpass the Earth, and make its curvilinear journey to the next half-moon phase on the east side of the Earth's trajectory around the sun? Would you predict that the moon needs to A. decelerate, B. continue at the same speed, C. accelerate a little, D. accelerate a lot, or E. accelerate to many times faster than the Earth? The answer is E, because, for one, the point in the moon's orbit when it's on the west side of the Earth's trajectory would be a point when the moon had been traveling in the opposite direction as the Earth, away from one another, then curving around the backside of the Earth using gravity of the Earth to slingshot the moon many times faster than the Earth, as the moon must somehow surpass the Earth, which is traveling 66,600 miles an hour, while the moon travels a mere 2288 miles per hour on average relative to the Earth. The moon must beat the Earth along the outside of the track, no less, by first catching up to the Earth 238,000 miles away, then pass the Earth another 8,000 miles, which is the diameter of the Earth, then reach the next half-moon phase, which is another 238,000 miles along the moon's alleged curved orbital path, within the same duration from one half-moon to the next. Now, keep in mind the moon somehow makes each leg of this journey from one half-moon to the next over approximately the same duration, or about 13.5 days between each adjacent half-moon. Now, if you think about this for 10 seconds objectively, it is physically impossible for the duration of each leg of this orbit to be remotely similar, let alone approximately equivalent, as the moon would be racing west 2288 miles per hour in the opposite direction as the Earth, doing 66,600 miles per hour east for the first leg of the orbit. Now, in case you haven't made the connection, the moon and the Earth would be traveling in the same direction for the second leg of the journey, or racing against one another, meaning the duration between one half-moon to the next should be wildly different comparatively, simply due to the law of physics involving relative speed. To give you an example of this, or relative speed, you can prove in daily life very easily. Just simply drive down the highway doing 65. The traffic to your left, also doing 65 coming towards you, will apparently zoom past you at 130 miles per hour relative to you. If you look at the traffic on your right, who are all doing, say, 70, they will apparently be moving 5 miles per hour faster than you. Now, the same rule applies to the moon when it's traveling either with traffic east or against traffic west, traffic being the Earth in this analogy, of course. Now, I've actually animated a helpful 2D model of orbital relationships of the galactic center to Sun to Earth to Moon in that order. And what I found by studying the finished animation, or really the lines ascribed to the paths of each object in the finished animation, is that the only way to make a theoretical third-generation satellite body such as the Moon work, in theory, is if the Moon greatly accelerates to extreme velocities at some points, and stands still or even retrogrades at other points due to the velocity of the Earth and the law of physics involving relative speed of independent bodies in motion, and the claim that the moon maintains a constant, or pretty much conscribed to the world as being a plane, and then later ascribed to the wandering stars, which must also be, like our world, and therefore plane became planet, and our world became a planet instead of a plane, if you can follow the ridiculous logic. So, anyway, this is my formal response to your comment that I just read, which I should have end quoted at,
I don't really know how you can deny this.
You're welcome for covering your video and the added exposure. Anytime. I only intended to make a short video, however, I've explained to you in another comment why a great deal of explanation is needed from my side of the argument, as a simple word is revered or bowed to by most people who believe in the globe, such as gravity. There's literally no way to convince a person that the heliocentric model is wrong. Each individual person must decide to reevaluate all of the previous assumptions that we've had about the world and the universe, and by extension ourselves, for our entire lives, and it can be a difficult thing to do. As for your analogy about the moons of Jupiter, by your logic, you can observe what appear to be spheres flying around in the night sky. Therefore, we must live on a sphere flying around in the night sky. The same logic dictates that since a bowling ball is spherical, then bowling pins must be spherical. Actually, a better way to depict your logic would be to assume that since you can see bowling pins at the end of the lane, then you, the observer, must also be a bowling pin, right? Same logic. So, what's so astonishingly ridiculous about your observation of Jupiter is the fact that you can see Jupiter with the naked eye. Jupiter has a diameter of about 87,000 miles, but you can see it from the ground with the naked eye at a minimum distance of 365 million miles away, and again, that's minimum. Now, keep in mind, about 90 million miles of this expanse between the Earth and Jupiter would be filled with the so-called asteroid belt, which should technically obstruct our view towards Jupiter, as the majority of objects comprising the so-called asteroid belt are more or less aligned to the ecliptic plane, just as Earth and Jupiter allegedly are in the heliocentric model. The problem is, the nearest portion of the asteroid belt is supposedly 1/4 of the distance to Jupiter, so much closer to us than Jupiter, and therefore would appear optically much larger, angular size. So you would expect all of the billions of alleged asteroids and meteoroids to apparently transit the inbound reflected light from Jupiter. But of course, we can see Jupiter with the naked eye at a minimum distance of 365 million miles and a maximum distance of 600 million miles, but at that point it would technically be on the opposite end of the sun, so we could never see it at its furthest. Could we? Right? Anyway, this isn't the main point of the matter, but if you actually believe you can see an object with a diameter of 87,000 miles from 365 million miles of space through 90 million miles, which is supposedly filled with billions of asteroids aligned with the Earth. Hey, what's up everybody? John TheMorgile back for a quick video response to some comments I received from Voice of Reason. I actually started doing this in the typical way, which would be to reply to his comments in the threads of my video, which worked a few times, so I was actually able to comment back and forth with him a couple of times. But for some reason, as you can see here, when I try to send a specific response to one of his comments, YouTube will simply not accept or allow me to post the comment. I've tried since yesterday, tried again today, saves it on a notepad file, so I'm doing a video response instead of making the comment. So I'm also going to respond to another comment that Voice of Reason placed on that video comments thread more recently, and just kill two birds with one stone, right? So I usually don't like a rigged game or unfair odds. But when you're debating someone about the game of chess, for example, when your opponent has only ever played checkers and knows nothing of chess, it's technically not a debate, as you must teach your opponent about the subject matter as opposed to debating the facts of the matter. To further this analogy to the comical level that it really ought to be if your opponent were to tell you that no such game as chess exists, and that checkers is the only board game of that sort, then the debate, which became a series of lessons to your opponent, finally becomes in its most absurd and proper analogous form, proving to your opponent that the game of chess actually does exist, whether they're aware of it or very good at it or not. So on we go to the original post from Voice of Reason in response to my Thanksgiving special video, which was a mega debunking of his attempt to debunk the reality of the static plane Earth. Now, Voice of Reason's original post was, quote,
Thanks for covering my video. I appreciate the added exposure and will enjoy responding to your claims. Orbital mechanics are a physical impossibility? Really? How so? I've watched the moons of Jupiter orbit the planet with a telescope. Have you? We can accurately predict the future positions of planets, comets, and asteroids using Newton's laws. How could that be? This is fully tested science. I really don't know how you can deny this.
Now, one thing I'll mention just sort of off the cuff real quick is that Ptolemy was able to predict, and accurately so, predict orbital patterns of planets using a geocentric model. So your argument there is invalid. The Earth doesn't have to be a globe in order to predict the orbital cycles of the wandering stars, aka planets. And I will remind you that the root of the word planet is plane, and was first and Jupiter. They would thus obstruct our view of the object, but that isn't even the point either. But if you do believe all this, I've got a bridge I'd love to sell you. The main subject of your comment involved orbital mechanics and how you think they are possible in a heliocentric model, when indeed such things as third-generation satellite bodies like the moon are indeed impossible. Now, the only possible way that you can maintain your position is without studying this subject objectively, or animating the alleged orbital relationships between the galactic center, the Sun, the Earth, and the Moon in that order. Now, orbital mechanics are indeed an impossibility in the heliocentric model for a variety of reasons, illustrated best by considering third-generation satellite bodies, such as the Moon. Now, I'm not going to try and bring out all of the arguments, as I've spent hundreds of hours making videos giving in-depth explanations disproving the viability of orbital mechanics in a heliocentric model, where all of the centers of orbit are in constant acceleration. Now, you're going to call foul on this and parrot scientism and say that they're not accelerating, but moving at an essentially constant, non-variable speeds. However, that is a complete fallacy. An object at a consistent speed traveling along a rectilinear path would certainly, be a good fixed frame of reference without any acceleration, like a train going exactly 50 miles an hour along a perfectly straight track without hitting any bumps. On the other hand, an object allegedly moving along a curvilinear path at 500,000 miles an hour, such as the Sun, would experience constant acceleration, as it's supposedly traveling at a constant speed along a parabolic curve. This acceleration due to curvilinear motion would cause massive centrifugal forces towards the outside edge of orbit due to traveling at a consistent speed along an inverse square curve. Next, you have the Earth, which is supposedly orbiting the Sun at a 60-degree angle to the Sun's orbital plane or orbital path at 66,600 miles an hour. Now, keep in mind, the galaxy is also supposedly traveling some millions of miles per hour at an angle which is divergent from the Sun's path, yet the Sun somehow remains fixed to a single plane of orbit relative to the galactic equator. Meanwhile, all this nonsense is allegedly occurring. The Earth itself is maintaining its perfect orbital plane relative to the Sun, aka the ecliptic, which is again a divergent angle to the plane of the Sun's orbit, or the solar plane. Finally, you have a theoretical third-generation satellite body, such as the Moon, which is allegedly racing around the Earth, roughly aligned to the ecliptic, about 5 degrees divergent from the ecliptic, at 2288 or 2,288 miles per hour. Now, if you can possibly imagine all of this motion, which is all constantly in relative flux from 1 second to the next, and the Moon is supposedly traveling in multiple conflicting directions simultaneously, while somehow maintaining a perfect plane of orbit relative to the Earth, although the three orbital hosts, the galactic center, the Sun, and the Earth, are constantly changing angular relationships between one another at varying speeds. Furthermore, each of these independent bodies somehow orbit one another along their own personal invariable plane of orbit round their